A freezing morning in 1830, and you're standing in a bustling market square in Yorkshire, England. The cobblestones under your feet are slick with frost, your breath puffing out in little clouds that vanish into the chilly air. The smell of hay and manure hangs heavy, the usual scent of a livestock market, but today something feels off. The crowd's murmur isn't the usual excitement of a cattle auction. It's heavier, tinged with curiosity, disgust, and something that makes your stomach twist. A woman, let's call her Sarah, stands on a makeshift platform. She's 28, her hands rough from years of scrubbing laundry, her face lined from a life harder than her years suggest. Around her neck is a coarse rope halter, the kind you'd use to lead a cow to market. Her husband John grips the other end, his voice slurring from the ale he chugged at dawn to steady his nerves. "What am I bid for this fine woman?" he bellows like he's selling a prized heifer. Strong back, good teeth, can cook and mend. The crowd presses closer, men eyeing Sarah like they would a horse at auction, checking her hands for calluses, her face, to see if she's comely enough to warm their bed. Her heart's pounding, her eyes darting between the faces because, in the next few minutes, her entire life will change. She might end up with a kinder man than John, or she might land in a worse nightmare. And here's the kicker, this isn't some back alley crime. This is wife selling, a perfectly accepted practice in Victorian England. And for Sarah, it's her only shot at freedom. Welcome to a history lesson you won't find in any textbook, folks. If you thought Game of Thrones was wild, buckle up, because the real-life drama of wife selling makes medieval fiction look like a kid's show. This was no urban legend. It was a desperate, degrading, and strangely dignified ritual where men sold their wives in public to escape marriages they couldn't legally end. And trust me, it's a story that'll make you grateful for modern divorce courts. If you're as shocked as I am by these forgotten corners of history, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from, because it's wild to think we're uncovering these stories together from all over the world. Let's set the stage. In 1830, Victorian England was a world where women were property, marriages were often traps, and divorce was a luxury only the rich could afford. Wife selling wasn't born from cruelty alone, though there was plenty of that. It was a loophole for the poor, a way to end a marriage when the law offered no other way out. Imagine you're Sarah standing there feeling the rope chafe your skin while strangers bid on your life like it's a Black Friday deal. It's humiliating, sure, but for some women it was also a flicker of hope, a chance to escape a husband who drank away the rent or left bruises she couldn't hide. To Americans, this might sound like something out of a dystopian novel, but it's not so far from our own history. Think about slave auctions in the 19th century South, where human beings were bought and sold in public squares. Wife selling wasn't slavery, but the parallels are chilling. Both reduced people to property, paraded before crowds for a price. Take a real case from 1826 in Brighton, England. A man led his wife to the market square and sold her to a sailor for £5, about $500 today. The newspaper, the Sussex Advertiser, noted she went nothing loath, meaning she was okay with it, probably because the sailor was her lover. This wasn't just a random sale, it was a staged act to make her new relationship legit in the eyes of the community. That's the twisted genius of wife selling. It was humiliating, but it was also a public declaration of a new start, witnessed by dozens, to give it a kind of rough justice. Here's where it gets wild. These sales weren't secret. They were advertised in newspapers like you'd advertise a horse or a used car. One ad from 1815 in the Leeds Mercury read, "John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market Tuesday next. Healthy, strong, good character. No reasonable offer refused." Can you imagine scrolling X and seeing that pop up? Why did this happen? Well, we'll dive deeper into the legal mess and economic desperation later. But here's the gist in Victorian England. Marriage was forever unless you had a fortune to burn or a grave to fill. For the working class stuck in loveless or abusive marriages, wife selling was their workaround, a public spectacle that screamed, "This marriage is over." It wasn't legal in the eyes of the law, but to the community it was as binding as a handshake deal. And for women like Sarah standing in that freezing square, it was a gamble between a bad situation and a potentially worse one. Maybe her buyer would be a kind widower who'd treat her right, or maybe he'd be another drunk with a heavy hand. The crowd knew it, she knew it, and that tension made these sales as gripping as any reality TV show. So what's the takeaway? Wife selling wasn't just about men dumping unwanted wives. It was a desperate act of survival in a world where the system left people no other choice. It's a reminder that when laws fail, people create their own solutions, no matter how shocking. Stick around because we're about to unravel why women were legally invisible, how these auctions worked, and the incredible stories of women who turned this degrading ritual into a shot at freedom. You don't learn this in history class, folks, but you're about to get schooled. All right, folks, let's dive into the twisted legal world that made wife selling not just possible, but practically inevitable. Picture this, it's 1820, and you're Mary Thompson, a young woman in a bustling Yorkshire town. You're running a little side hustle, baking bread and selling it at the market. You've got a knack for it. Your loaves are the talk of the town, and you're saving every penny for a better life. Then you get married and poof, everything you've worked for vanishes. Your money, your bread, even the apron you're wearing. Legally, it all belongs to your husband now. In Victorian England, coverture wasn't just a rule, it was a way of life that crushed women's rights. A famous lawyer, Sir William Blackstone, summed it up in 1753. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is consolidated and incorporated into that of her husband. Translation: the moment you said, "I do," you stopped being a person under the law. Your wages, his. Your inheritance, his. That bread business Mary worked so hard to build her husband, let's call him William, could take every cent and blow it on ale at the pub, and the law would just shrug. Want to sue him for gambling away your kids' food money? Tough luck, Mary couldn't even step into a courtroom without William's permission. It's like signing a marriage certificate meant signing away your entire existence. For Americans, think of it like this. Imagine getting married and suddenly your bank account, your car, even your Netflix password all belong to your spouse, and there's nothing you can do about it. Sounds like a bad prenup, right? Now imagine it's not just bad, it's the law. Let's bring this to life with a real story. In 1805, Elizabeth Wilson, a seamstress in London, inherited a small sum from her father, enough to open a shop and start fresh. But she was married, and her husband, a drunkard named Thomas, swooped in and claimed every shilling. Court records show he sold her sewing tools and spent the money in taverns, leaving Elizabeth and their 2 kids penniless. When she tried to protest, the magistrate told her, "Your husband's rights are absolute." Absolute. That word hits like a sledgehammer, doesn't it? Elizabeth was trapped, legally erased, her dreams reduced to her husband's bar tab. And here's the kicker. If Thomas beat her for complaining, say leaving her with a black eye or broken ribs, the law called it reasonable chastisement. A husband could correct his wife like she was a misbehaving dog, and as long as he didn't kill her, the courts didn't care. For our American viewers, this might remind you of early US. Laws before women's suffrage, when wives had no property rights either. But in England, coverture was so ironclad it made wife selling look like a reasonable escape plan. Here's where it gets even darker. Coverture didn't just steal your money or your voice, it stole your safety. If William came home drunk and decided to correct Mary with a stick, she had no legal recourse. If he brought home diseases from brothels or sold her clothes to pay gambling debts, she couldn't complain. And if she tried to leave, good luck. As a married woman, Mary had no legal identity to rent a room, sign a contract, or even buy food without her husband's say-so. It's like being locked in a cage where your abuser holds the key and the deed to your life. This wasn't some medieval throwback. Coverture was alive and well in the 19th century, when America was already starting to loosen up on women's property rights with laws like the Married Women's Property Act in states like New York by 1848. England, they were stuck in the dark ages, legally speaking. Now you might be thinking, surely not every husband was a monster, and you're right, some men were decent. But coverture didn't care about intentions. It gave husbands absolute power, and absolute power can turn even a halfway decent guy into a tyrant. A common misconception is that coverture only applied to the poor, but it shackled every married woman, rich or poor. The difference: rich women had family influence or social clout to cushion the blow. Poor women like Mary or Elizabeth, they were at the mercy of men who might be desperate, drunk, or just plain cruel. That's why wife selling became a thing, not because men were all evil, but because the law gave them no other way to end a marriage that wasn't working. It was like trying to fix a broken car with a sledgehammer, messy, brutal, but sometimes the only tool available. So what's the big takeaway? Coverture didn't just make women property. It made wife selling a twisted kind of logic. When the law says you're not a person, that your husband owns your body, and soul selling you in a market square starts to look like a loophole, not a crime. It's a gut punch reminder that legal systems can shape lives in ways that seem unthinkable today. Stick with me, because next we're diving into why divorce was impossible for the poor and how that pushed people to these desperate measures. Let's crank up the time machine and zoom back to 1820s Yorkshire, where marriage wasn't just a vow, it was a life sentence. You're Jane, a washerwoman with aching hands and 3 kids to feed. Your husband Tom drinks away every shilling you earn, and when he's not at the pub, he's leaving bruises you hide under your shawl. You're desperate to escape to give your kids a better life, maybe even find a man who doesn't treat you like a punching bag. But here's the gut punch in Victorian England: getting out of a marriage was about as easy as winning the lottery, unless you were rich, dead, or willing to risk everything. So let's break it down. For folks like Jane trapped in a miserable marriage, there were only 5 ways to end it, and none of them were pretty. First, you could try a mutual separation, agree to live apart. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. You couldn't remarry, and if Tom decided to drag Jane back home, the law was on his side. Plus, Jane had no money to support herself. Remember, her wages legally belonged to Tom. Second option, desertion. Just run away and pray he doesn't find you. But for a woman with kids, no savings and no legal identity, disappearing was like trying to vanish in a small town where everyone knows your business. Third, you could beg the church courts for a legal separation, but you needed proof of adultery or life-threatening cruelty, and even then, it cost a fortune, and remarriage was off the table. Fourth, well, you could die. And in an era of cholera and childbirth deaths, that wasn't exactly rare, but it's hardly a plan. Finally, there was wife-selling, humiliating, sure, but it was the only option that offered a shot at a new life witnessed by the community to make it official. For Americans, think of it like this: imagine divorce in the US today costing as much as a luxury car, say $60,000, and requiring a special vote in Congress. That's what Jane was up against. Let's talk numbers to drive this home. Before 1857, getting a divorce in England required a private act of Parliament. Cost at least $1,000, about $150,000 in today's money. That's more than most working-class families would see in a lifetime. Even after the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act made divorce slightly easier through the courts, it still cost around $40, roughly $5,000 today. For a laborer earning 10 shillings a week, that's like saving up for a decade without eating. Compare that to modern America, where no-fault divorce laws let you split for a few $100 in court fees. Back then, divorce was a rich man's game, like buying a yacht or a private island. For the poor, it might as well have been on the moon. Let's ground this in a real story. In 1819, a woman named Hannah Brown in Leeds tried to escape her abusive husband, James, who beat her so badly she lost an eye. She deserted him, fleeing to a cousin's house with her 2 kids. But James tracked her down, and because she was still his property, the local magistrate forced her back. The Yorkshire Gazette reported Hannah's plea: "I'd rather die than live with him." Within a year, she was dead, worn out by poverty and abuse. Desertion failed because women like Hannah had nowhere to go. No money, no legal rights, and a society that shamed runaway wives. Church separations? Forget it. You needed proof of something, like adultery, and even then the process was so costly, it was out of reach. One 1823 case in York cost a woman $50 in legal fees for a separation she never got because her husband's lawyer outmaneuvered her. It's like trying to fight a legal battle with no lawyer, no money, and no voice. Here's a common misconception. People often think the poor just dealt with bad marriages like it was no big deal. But for women like Jane or Hannah, staying meant starvation, beatings, or watching their kids go hungry while their husbands gambled away the rent. The stakes were life or death, and the law didn't care. That's why wife-selling wasn't just a weird custom. It was a desperate workaround, a way to say, "I'm done," when the system offered no exit. It's not unlike how some Americans in the early 20th century faked deaths or fled states to escape bad marriages before no-fault divorce existed. The difference: wife-selling was public, humiliating, and wrapped in a rope halter. What's the lesson here? When the law locks people in cages, whether it's a bad marriage or an unfair system, they'll find a way to break free, even if it's messy. Wife-selling was born from that desperation, a twisted solution to an impossible problem. It shows how far people will go when they're given no good choices. Hang tight, because next we're stepping into the wild theater of the wife-selling auction itself. Trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. If this history's blowing your mind, hit that subscribe button. And let's keep uncovering these hidden truths together. Okay folks, buckle up because we're stepping right into the heart of the madness, the wife-selling auction itself. Imagine you're in a Yorkshire market, square 1830, the air thick with the stench of livestock and the buzz of a curious crowd. A woman, let's call her Ellen, 30 years old with work-worn hands and a defiant glint in her eye, stands on a rickety platform. Around her neck is a rough rope halter, the kind you'd tie to a cow, chafing her skin with every nervous shift. Her husband Robert, red-faced from a morning pint, hollers like a seasoned auctioneer. "What am I bid for this fine woman? She's sturdy, can sew, and still has all her teeth." Men in the crowd, farmers, laborers, maybe a sly butcher, step forward, squinting at Ellen like she's a horse at a fair. They check her calloused palms, size up her frame, even ask her to smile to prove Robert's not lying about those teeth. It's humiliating, grotesque, and yet this bizarre theater was the only way Ellen might trade one life for another. If you're as stunned as I am by this forgotten history, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. What's the wildest thing you've heard about old school marriage? Let's dive into this twisted ritual that turned divorce into a public spectacle. This wasn't some random act of cruelty, it was a carefully staged performance, dripping with symbolism and community buy-in. Wife-selling auctions were like a mix of a livestock sale, a courtroom drama, and a reality TV showdown. They usually kicked off with an ad in the local newspaper, like something you'd see on Craigslist today. Picture this: a notice in the Staffordshire Advertiser from 1830 reads, "Robert Turner will sell his wife Ellen at Lock Market Saturday next. Healthy, skilled at needlework, no reasonable offer refused." On the big day, the husband led his wife to the market square where pigs and sheep were sold, mind you, with a halter around her neck, arm, or waist. Sometimes it was rope, sometimes a ribbon to soften the blow, but the message was clear: she was property ready to be transferred. The husband, playing auctioneer, would hype her up, her strength, her skills, her looks, while bidders haggled, offering anything from a glass of ale to a hefty $100, about $15,000 today. Once the deal was struck, the halter was handed to the buyer, sealing the sale like a handshake on a used car lot. For our American viewers, think of it like a public auction for a vintage Mustang, except the item is a human being, and the stakes are her entire future. Let's zoom in on a real case to make this hit home. In 1830, at Lock Market, a woman named Anne was sold for 2 shillings and sixpence, about $3 today. The Staffordshire Advertiser reported she was all in on the deal, snapping at her hesitant husband, "Let be you, rogue, I will be sold. I want to change." Anne's buyer was likely her lover, and the whole auction was a staged act to make their new relationship legit in the community's eyes. This wasn't just a transaction, it was theater, a public divorce and remarriage rolled into one, witnessed by dozens, to give it weight. The halter wasn't just for show either. It tied the ritual to ancient English property laws, where handing over a rope or a key symbolized a legal transfer. It's like signing a deed, but instead of a house, it's a wife, in the market square. That wasn't random, it was where communities sealed deals from cattle to crops. So holding wife sales there screamed, "This is official." To Americans, it's like holding a divorce hearing in a Walmart parking lot, public, practical, and impossible to ignore. Here's where it gets even crazier. These auctions were as much about spectacle as they were about business. Crowds didn't just watch, they participated, cheering, jeering, or even stepping in if things got unfair. The whole setup was a grotesque parody of a wedding, complete with a vow in the form of bids, and a feast afterward at the local pub, often paid for by the new husband. Some sales even ended with church bells ringing, like in an 1827 case in Lincolnshire, where the crowd treated it like a twisted marriage ceremony. For visual folks, imagine this on your screen: a grainy sketch of a market square men in top hats and aprons, circling a woman in a halter, or a faded newspaper ad, flashing up with the words "wife for sale." It's the kind of imagery that'd make your jaw drop. Now, a common misconception is that wife selling was just men dumping unwanted wives like trash. Not always. Many sales were planned with the wife's consent, often with her lover as the buyer, to escape a bad marriage. But don't get it twisted, it was still degrading, a public humiliation, dressed up as a solution. The lesson: When society leaves you no options, you create your own, even if they're messy and morally murky. Wife selling was a desperate act to rewrite the rules when the rulebook was stacked against you. For Americans, think of it like those wild stories of people faking their deaths in the 1800s to dodge debts or bad marriages. It's extreme, but it's what you do when the system screws you over. This ritual wasn't just a transaction. It was a stage where desperation, community, and survival collided. Stick around, because next we're diving into how women like Ellen turned this degrading act into a shot at freedom. Trust me, their stories will blow your mind. Let's flip the script on this dark tale of wife selling. You've seen the market square the rope, halters the men bidding like they're at a cattle auction. It's easy to picture these women as helpless victims paraded like livestock with no say in their fate. But hold up, here's where it gets wild. Many of these women weren't just standing there trembling and silent. Some were calling the shots, turning this humiliating ritual into their ticket out of a miserable life. Picture this, it's 1832. Carlisle, England, and a woman named Margaret stands on a platform, her husband shouting bids to a restless crowd. A stranger offers 3 shillings, but Margaret's not having it. She locks eyes with him, shakes her head, and says, "I won't go to you. I choose my own path." The crowd gasps, the auction stalls, and suddenly this degrading scene becomes something else, a moment of defiance, a spark of power in a system built to crush her. Here's the deal, wife selling wasn't always about men dumping unwanted wives. Often it was a staged act, a desperate dance where women played a leading role. Many sales were prearranged with a lover or a kinder man, turning the auction into a public divorce and remarriage all in one. The wife would agree to the sale, sometimes even pushing for it to escape a husband who beat her, drank their money away, or just made life unbearable. It was humiliating standing there while men haggled over your worth, but for some women it was a calculated risk, their only shot at a better future. Think of it like a high-stakes gamble, endure the shame of a public sale for a chance at freedom. For Americans, it's not unlike women in the early 20th century who fought for suffrage, standing up to ridicule and arrest to claim their voice. These Victorian women didn't have picket signs, but they had their own kind of rebellion played out in market squares. Let's bring this to life with a real story. In 1832 in Carlisle, a woman, let's call her Margaret from the records, stood up during her auction and refused every bidder she didn't like. The Carlisle Patriot reported the crowd turning hostile, nearly rioting, when she kept saying no, but Margaret held firm. She'd arranged the sale with a man she trusted, a widower who'd been kind to her, and she wasn't about to let some random farmer buy her for a few coins. The auction fell apart, and the magistrate had to step in to calm things down. Margaret's defiance wasn't just gutsy, it was a power move, a way to say, "I may be property in your eyes, but I'm not going without a fight." This wasn't rare either. In 1822 in Plymouth, a woman named Sarah provided the money herself to pay an agent to buy her from her drunken husband, according to local court records. She orchestrated her own escape, turning the auction into her liberation. Can you imagine the courage it took to stand there with a rope around your neck and still call the shots? Now let's be clear, this agency came at a brutal cost. Even when women like Margaret or Sarah arranged their sales, they were still playing by rules that treated them like chattel. They had to endure strangers poking at their hands, judging their looks, or debating their temperament like they were buying a horse. And even if the sale went as planned, the new husband legally owned them just as much as the old one did. It's like trading one cage for another, hoping the new one has better bars. For Americans, think of the women's suffrage movement. Again, those early victories, like the right to vote in 1920, didn't erase all inequalities, just like a successful wife sale didn't make a woman free. But these women weren't passive. They were strategizing, negotiating in secret, sometimes even bullying their husbands into going through with the sale when second thoughts hit. A common misconception is that every wife sold was a victim dragged to the market against her will. That's true for some, horrifyingly so, but the historical record shows women often had a hand in the deal. They met lovers in secret, planned the auction, even set the price. In 1830 at Lock Market, a woman named Anne famously snapped at her husband, "Let be you, rogue, I will be sold," when he wavered, as reported in the Staffordshire Advertiser. She wasn't just going along, she was driving the bus. This flips the narrative. Wife selling wasn't just about men's power. It was about women clawing back what little control they could in a system rigged against them. The lesson, even in the darkest corners of history, people find ways to fight back. These women weren't just surviving, they were rewriting their stories one auction at a time. For your YouTube screen picture, this a reenactment of Margaret and Carlisle, staring down the crowd with fire in her eyes, or a faded newspaper clipping flashing up with Anne's bold words. It's the kind of visual that'd make you lean forward in your seat. These women's stories show us that agency isn't always loud or obvious. It's in the quiet calculations, the whispered plans, the refusal to break. Stick with me, because next we're diving into the crowds who watch these sales, not just spectators but players, in a wild drama of their own. If you're hooked on these tales of survival, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep uncovering history's hidden truths together. Let's zoom back to that frostbitten Yorkshire market square in 1830. But this time we're not with the woman on the platform or the husband calling out bids. We're in the crowd, shoulder to shoulder with farmers, shopkeepers, and nosy neighbors, their breaths steaming in the chilly air. The energy's electric, like a reality show finale mixed with a courtroom drama. A woman named Alice stands up there, rope halter loose around her waist as her husband shouts, "4 shillings for this fine lass." But the crowd isn't just here for the show. They're players in this wild game, cheering, jeering, and sometimes stepping in to make sure things don't go too far. This isn't just a spectacle, it's rough justice, a community deciding what's fair in a world where the law left them hanging. These auctions weren't just about buying and selling, they were community events, like a twisted mix of a county fair and a public trial. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, showed up, drawn by the drama of a marriage ending right before their eyes. They'd gossip, laugh, even place bets on the final price, treating it like a 19th century reality show. But here's the kicker: the crowd wasn't just there to gawk. They were witnesses, giving the sale a kind of unofficial legitimacy. In a world without divorce courts for the poor, a crowd's approval made the deal binding in the community's eyes, like a notarized contract, but with more shouting and ale. For Americans, think of it like a small-town meeting in colonial New England, where the whole village weighed in on disputes, or even those viral videos of public proposals gone wrong. Everyone's watching, judging, and ready to react. Let's paint a real picture. In 1819, in Ashbourne, Derbyshire, a wife sale went sideways when the crowd turned on the husband. The Derby Mercury reported that locals pelted a magistrate who tried to stop the auction, shouting that it was their custom. They weren't just defending a tradition, they were protecting their right to settle things their way. When the sale seemed unfair, like if a woman looked terrified or the buyer was a known creep, the crowd could turn ugly, booing, or even breaking up the deal. In 1849 in Goole, a woman named Mary snapped her fingers at her ex-husband after being sold to her lover for 5 shillings, and the crowd cheered her on according to the Hull packet. They loved the drama, but they also enforced a rough moral code: the sale had to feel right, or they'd let you know it. For your YouTube screen, imagine a sketch of that Goole crowd, men in flat caps and women in shawls roaring approval as Mary struts off, or a newspaper headline flashing up, "Wife sold for 5 shillings. Crowd applauds." Now let's get real, this wasn't just entertainment. The crowd was the community's conscience stepping in when things crossed a line. In 1837 in Halifax, a blacksmith tried to sell his wife for 1 shilling, then changed his mind. But when he sold her again to a married man, the crowd wasn't having it. The Halifax Guardian noted that the wife mauled her faithless spouse rather severely, as the crowd egged her on refusing to let an unfair sale stand. This wasn't chaos, it was a kind of justice, raw and unpolished. For Americans, it's like a jury in a small-town courtroom, or even those old westerns where the townsfolk decide a rustler's fate. The crowd didn't just watch, they judged, and their verdict mattered. A common misconception is that these crowds were just voyeurs out for a cheap thrill. Sure, they loved the spectacle, who wouldn't? It was free drama in a world without Netflix, but they were also gatekeepers, making sure the sale wasn't outright cruel. If a woman was clearly unwilling or the buyer was a brute, they'd intervene, sometimes with fists or rotten vegetables. The lesson here: communities can shape justice when the law fails, but it's messy, part carnival, part courtroom, part mob. These crowds show us that even in a brutal system, people crave fairness, even if they delivered it in a way that shocks us today. This rough justice wasn't perfect, but it gave wife selling its strange legitimacy. It's a reminder that when systems break down, people step up or step in to set things right, for better or worse. Hang tight because next we're diving into the economic desperation that fueled these sales. It's a gritty tale of survival you won't want to miss. If you're hooked on this wild history, hit that subscribe button and let's keep peeling back the past together. Let's pull back the curtain on the gritty reality that pushed wife selling into the spotlight. It's 1830s Yorkshire, and the air is thick with coal smoke, the clatter of factories drowning out the old rural rhythms. You're Emma, a mother of two, living in a cramped, damp room that reeks of mildew. You're washing clothes until your hands bleed, earning a few pennies a week, while your husband George labors in a mill for 10 shillings if he's lucky. Rent's due, the kids are hungry, and George's drinking habit means half your money's already gone at the pub. This isn't just a bad marriage, it's a fight for survival in a world turned upside down by industry. Wife selling didn't just happen because of bad laws or rowdy crowds. It was born from bone-deep poverty in a society where families were breaking under the weight of a new economic reality. Industrial England, especially Yorkshire, was a pressure cooker. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Factories popping up, towns swelling with workers, and traditional farm life fading fast. Families like Emma's weren't working together on the land anymore. Men toiled in mills, women took in laundry or worked looms, and kids as young as 6 were sent to factories for 12-hour shifts. A laborer's wage, about 10 shillings a week, or $15 today, was barely enough for bread and rent, let alone coal to keep warm. When a marriage went sour, there was no cushion to fall back on. If George drank away the rent, or Emma couldn't keep the kids fed, the whole family could end up in the workhouse, a grim prison-like place where families were split up and worked to the bone. For Americans, think of the Great Depression, when families in the 1930s Dust Bowl scraped by, selling whatever they could to survive. In Yorkshire, wife selling became one of those desperate trades, not just a divorce, but a way to rearrange who carried the economic burden. Let's ground this in a real story. In 1837 in Merthyr Tydfil, a Welsh mining town close to Yorkshire's industrial vibe, a woman named Mary Ann Price was sold for 4 shillings and sixpence, about $6 today. The Merthyr Guardian noted this happened during a brutal economic slump when coal mines cut wages and jobs dried up. Mary Ann's husband, a collier addicted to drink, couldn't support her or their kids. The sale wasn't just about ending a marriage, it was about survival. Her buyer, likely a lover, could offer a roof and food where her husband couldn't. This wasn't rare. Yorkshire, with its textile mills and coal mines, saw 27 of the 108 documented wife sales in the Victorian era, more than any other region. Why? Because places like Leeds and Sheffield were hit hard by industrial poverty, low wages, long hours, and no safety net. Alcohol didn't help. Many sales started in taverns where men half-drunk and broke saw, selling their wife as a quick fix to get a few coins and offload a burden. Here's where it gets messy. Wife selling wasn't just about money, it was about redistributing responsibility. A new husband wasn't just buying a wife. He was taking on her kids, her labor, her survival. It was like a grim economic contract, a way to shift the weight of poverty from one man to another. For Americans, it's not unlike gig workers today, juggling multiple jobs to stay afloat. When the system fails, you hustle however you can. Wife selling was that hustle for the 19th century, a way to survive when marriage stopped being a partnership and became a liability. For your YouTube screen, picture this: a smoky Yorkshire street factory, chimneys looming, and a faded newspaper ad flashing. Up, wife for sale, Leeds market cheap. It's the kind of visual that screams desperation. A common misconception is that wife selling was just a quirky tradition, like a village fair. Nope, it was a symptom of a society where poverty left no room for romance or even basic stability. Marriage for the poor wasn't about love, it was an economic deal, and when that deal broke, wife selling patched the gap. The lesson: economic hardship doesn't just break bank accounts, it breaks families, pushing people to extreme measures. These sales show how far people will go when survival's on the line, turning love into a transaction and dignity into a price tag. This economic desperation set the stage for wife selling's rise, but it's not the whole story. Next, we're exploring why this practice faded away and what it teaches us about progress and its limits. Now let's close this wild ride with the end of wife selling and why its echoes still haunt us today. Picture Leeds, 1913. The coal smoke's thinner now, factories humming less frantically. A woman stands in a quiet alley, no halter, no crowd, just a hushed deal where her husband sells her to a workmate for £1. It's the last recorded wife sale in England, a fading whisper of a practice that once drew thousands. By the early 20th century, wife selling wasn't just rare, it was a relic mocked as barbaric and buried by a changing world. But its decline wasn't just progress, it was a slow, messy shift that left lessons we're still grappling with. If these forgotten stories have you hooked, like they've got me, smash that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. What's a historical practice you think we've outgrown, or have we? Let's unravel why wife selling died out and what it says about our world today. So what killed wife selling? It wasn't one thing, it was a perfect storm. Starting in the 1840s, the middle class, with their starched collars and newfound moral outrage, turned up their noses at these public spectacles. Newspapers, once neutral, started calling wife sales disgusting exhibitions, like in an 1845 Times editorial that sneered at the brutality of Yorkshire markets. Religious groups like the Salvation Army piled on, preaching that marriage was sacred, not a livestock deal. In 1889, ironically, a Salvation Army member in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, sold his wife for £1, as reported in the Nottingham Evening Post. Proof even reformers couldn't escape the desperation that fueled the practice. But the real game changer was legal reform. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 started chipping away at the idea that wives were property, letting women keep their earnings and inheritances. By 1923, the Matrimonial Causes Act made divorce more accessible, though still pricey. Think $2,000 in today's money, not pocket change, but not a king's ransom either. For Americans, it's like the shift after the 19th Amendment in 1920, when women's rights started reshaping society bit by bit. Let's zoom in on a real case to seal this. In 1865, in Leeds, a woman and her 2 kids were sold for $150, about $22,000 today, according to the Leeds Mercury. The buyer took on her whole family, a massive financial leap, showing how wife selling was still a serious economic deal in its twilight. But by then, the practice was on life support. Courts got tougher, slapping 6-month jail terms on sellers and buyers for conspiracy to commit adultery. Urban growth and railroads made it easier to just disappear if you wanted out of a marriage, no need for a public auction. Plus, the rise of social welfare like poor relief programs meant families weren't always one bad day from starvation. Wife selling faded not because people suddenly got enlightened, but because the world gave them better options, or at least less humiliating ones. Now here's where it gets deep. Wife selling's legacy isn't just a weird footnote. It's a mirror reflecting what happens when laws and economies fail people. Back then, women like our fictional Emma or real-life Marianne Price traded dignity for survival because the system offered nothing else. Today we see shadows of that in human trafficking or forced marriages in some parts of the world, where people are still treated as property when legal protections fall short. For Americans, think of modern struggles like undocumented immigrants who can't access courts, or domestic abuse victims stuck because legal aid is out of reach. Wife selling shows us that when systems ignore human needs, people create their own solutions, no matter how ugly. For your YouTube screen picture, this a black and white photo of a 1913 Leeds alley, or a courtroom sketch of a wife seller facing a judge, fading into a modern-day protest for women's rights. It's a visual bridge from past to present. A common misconception is that wife selling vanished because society grew up and saw women as equals. Nope, it faded because of practical changes. Better laws, more jobs, less desperation, not some grand moral awakening. The lesson: progress isn't inevitable. It's built on hard-won reforms and people demanding better. Wife selling's story reminds us that rights we take for granted, like divorce or owning property, came from centuries of struggle, often paid for with shame and sacrifice. It's a gut check for today. What systems are failing people now, forcing them into desperate choices? We've come a long way from those market squares, but the questions linger. Wife selling wasn't just a bizarre custom, it was a cry for justice in a world that offered none. Thanks for joining me on this journey through history's shadows. If you've loved uncovering these truths, hit that subscribe button. Share this video, and let's keep digging into the past to understand our present. What's next? Tell me in the comments, what historical topic should we tackle together?